turn it. Before we begin, I'm just going to put one more quick thing on the table for a conversation, and we've covered a lot of ground here today. Thank you all very much. And it's something that I went to the Cinco de Mayo party at the Cuatro de Mayo party at the White House last night, and what was interesting for me, and just a quick reflection, was the issue of race, and something that we have, I think, a hard time talking about in many ways in these sort of convenient rooms that we all have these conversations with together, and about how radical, in some ways, this presidency really is at its core. Because of if you look at all of American history, I mean, the issue of race has been a defining issue in domestic American politics virtually throughout every period of our history, and certainly from the signing of the building of the Republic and up through the Civil War, and then again, particularly since in the 1960s, up through this recent era. It is really one of the reasons that I believe that the Republicans are so out of power right now, is that I think it's impossible to understand the rise of modern conservatism without attaching its core domestic argument to be the exploitation of racial grievance. That in essence, the entire foundation underneath the modern Republican Party was the exploitation of the democratic desire to bring everybody together, to fight against the sort of racial common good and the coming together of disparate peoples. And I think that, I'm not saying that the Republican agenda during this era of conservative ascendancy was racist. That's not what I'm saying at all. But it was based on racial exploitation. And that when the living repudiation of that philosophy was the election of Barack Hussein Obama and Malia and Sasha and Michelle and this remarkable family that is just down the street from us here, who've certainly inspired my kids, right? In addition, I think, we joke that the biggest fundraiser Barack could ever do would be to auction off a play date at the White House, not in the Lincoln bedroom, not a sleepover, right? And I think that with Malia and Sasha. But the thing is that I think that we are entering a very different period in the history of our racial relations and the fundamental racial construct of the United States. Throughout all of our history, what race was in America was a white-black, majority-minority, and frankly exploitive and pernicious experience in this country. And what we're now entering, in part because not only did we see the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in the mid-1960s, but we also saw the Immigration Act of 1965, which may be the most profound piece of legislation that nobody's ever heard of, which changed the immigration targets in the United States away from Europeans towards Asians and Latin Americans, is that we've seen a tripling in the minority population in the United States in just 40 years. We're going through what may be the most profound demographic transformation in our history as a people since the arrival of the Europeans here in the 15th, 16th, and 17th century. And I think it's something that we don't really quite yet understand how to talk about. We're aware of it, right? We're aware of it. All those Latin baseball players, right? Where did they all come from? Or where, you have all these examples of how the country has changed. But it's also something that we have not really come to a common conversation point about how race itself, I think, is moving from something that was capable of exploitation, where the Republican argument essentially, if you look, I think, at the entire domestic project, if we use that word today, the Republican Party, from the 1960s up until recently, let's just take tax and spend. What tax and spend is that it was all about race, right? It wasn't about economics. It was about taxing. The basic argument was those Democrats want to take money away from white people and give them to black people, right? That's what it was. It wasn't anything more complicated than that. And this idea that there was some powerful intellectual argument undergirding conservative economics, I think, is a joke. It was all about race, and it was all about exploiting racial fear. And so part of the reason these guys have unraveled to the degree that they have and why their road back is so long is that, the foundation of their modern success was speaking to a racial construct in America that doesn't exist anymore and that will never come back, because we're heading towards being a majority-minority country in 2040, 2042. Certainly the Democratic Party will be a majority-minority political party within the next 10 years. In the Texas primary in 2008, a majority of the people who voted in the Democratic Party were non-white. In California, it was 48%. And so California and Texas, the two largest states, the Democratic Party are functionally already majority-minority political parties, forgetting about the composition of the schools in Los Angeles, right, which are 90–95% Latino today. And I think that, so part of what I just want to put on the table here is that, you know, one of the great early sort of takeaways that I have is how profoundly our understanding of what race can be is changing in America. And that what race was exploitive, pernicious, destructive throughout our history. What race is becoming, because of this remarkable leader and his incredible family and the team that's running the White House, is something that celebrates our difference, that frankly celebrates the core, I think, a value that really founded America more than anything else was tolerance, right? I mean, and when you go back and look at the founding of this country and you look at the values that, you know, sort of we were built upon, tolerance may be the single most powerful one that we could sort of build. Freedom, you know, you go through your list of things that sort of really speak to the America that you want. To me, tolerance is one that is very core. And I think that we're coming to a new place, I think, about tolerance and understanding of otherness, this sort of sociological other in our lives, which if in the age of fear, where we had no allies, we only had adversaries, where even Europe old Europe was no longer our friend, where George Bush's essential argument was that we were by ourselves, you know, he had a very dark and pessimistic understanding of humanity. You know, Barack's rise and his own personal narrative and his own story is an extraordinary validation, I think, of the central argument of liberalism, right? That we're all in this together and anybody can get ahead, and that, you know, anything essentially is possible with hard work and good fortune and remarkable people. And I think that we are only just beginning. And I think this really hit me, and I'll end with this, was if anybody of you watched the town hall meeting he did in Strasbourg, France, when Barack had Europeans cheering him, a little bit of a different experience than when Bush went to Europe, right? And you saw, you know, cheering him as if he was a man to be cheered, right? I mean, this is what was interesting was, and I feel that Barack is becoming, in terms of foreign policy, he's becoming the leaders of the world's people, but not the world's governments, right? Because I don't think a lot of governmental leaders want Barack to come into their country and have one of those town hall meetings, because it makes them look less than adequate, right? When he comes in and is so respectful. At one point in that,
I don't think Sarkozy has that problem.
Sarkozy has that. Well, I won't go there. I'm not going to go there on the Sarkozy thing. I'll just conclude with this by saying that to me, one of the most amazing moments of that whole, what was a remarkable thing for me to watch, was when a person got up who was an American, and he said, "You guys get to ask questions of me back home. Let's let the Europeans get a chance at this." And he got a huge ovation from the Europeans for saying, come on, let's be fair. We're all in this together. We have a common purpose. And I just think that this issue of that we are just beginning to, I think, to come to understand of the racial implications of his rise and the moment that we're entering as a nation. There's also an incredibly powerful global extrapolation of that. Because, you know, if you look at the global population today, and I'll conclude with this, we're close to 7 billion people today. The white Europeans, right, are less than 1 billion of that. I mean, most of the world's people are non-white, you know, somewhere between, you know, I don't have the exact math right here, it's 60, 70, 80%. And that our destiny as a people is going to be increasingly dictated by non-white, non-European leaders. And what a symbol that this guy is for this moment in human history and the rise of the rest, as Fareed Zakaria calls it, where, you know, slumdog millionaire, however you want to put all this, right? That this guy, from his parentage, given the racial history of the United States, what an extraordinary affirmation of the goodness of humanity, right? And I think that that export that he has, both domestically and globally, is going to be one of those things that I think is this intangible, that this personal narrative, which is the most powerful personal narrative potentially that any American president has ever had in all of our history, is going to be such an incredible weapon for him to bring people together to solve our common domestic and global problems. But let's commit, the four of us up on stage, to figure out how to engage in this conversation about race, to find new vocabulary, new words, because I think there is something deeply profound going on in the country that I think Washington has been slow to figure out.